When you're signed off with your pilot's license or certificate, you ultimately become responsible for your own continued learning. And in this flight debrief, I'll recap my latest learning moment, one that led me to setting some new personal minimums and taking my shortest flight to date. It's the Easter long weekend and I've had one of the club's Tecnam Eaglets booked in for a flight late Sunday afternoon. After missing out on tickets to the Melbourne F1 Grand Prix the previous weekend, I figured this would be a good compensation by doubling my octane dose by taking a flight out from Lethbridge, around the Phillip Island GP circuit and back via the Melbourne coastal route, giving some great views of the Albert Park track. Some pilots really like flying alone, but I personally love taking people up in the air and introducing them to this whole side of aviation. So after putting the invitation out there was a seat available, my mother-in-law's put her hand up for a first flight with me. Now I've been checking the weather in the days leading up to the flight, and although there was some cloud forecast in the morning, it should all well and truly have lifted by the afternoon, leaving nothing but clear skies and light winds and perfect conditions for taking someone out on their first flight. So the morning of the flight rolls around and I'm finishing off my flight plan, so I check the latest weather, and as expected, the wind and cloud is looking pretty good, but there's a small detail on the gaff that's caught my eye. There's an isolated smoke layer being reported up to 6,000 feet with visibility down to 4,000 meters across some of where I want to fly. Now, there's a couple of problems here. As a VFR-only pilot, I need at least a minimum of 5 kilometers of visibility to go out on this flight. So if I can avoid the smoky areas, then technically I'll be fine, but how would I know what areas are affected? Isolated on a gaff chart typically means anywhere up to 50% of the area affected. So does this mean it's 5% or 45% of this area? And which side of the area is most likely to be affected? Can't really tell from these charts, but we have plenty of tools up our sleeve to help get a better picture of what's actually going on. It's the tail end of summer at the moment, the ground's still super dry, we've had bushfires in the areas and farmers are likely burning off crops around the area. So after checking some live satellite image feeds, I can see there's a couple of spots that are likely kicking up the smoke in the area. The wind looks like it should be blowing it away from where we're traveling, so I'm not seeing any need to scrub the flight at the moment, but I'm definitely keeping an eye on it. Just before heading off to the airport, I do one more weather check, this time looking at the METAR services from some of the surrounding airports, and both Moorabbin and Essendon have actually moved into IFR-like conditions. Due to haze, visibility is now below 4,000 meters. Both Avalon and Ballarat are still reporting all clear, so it's looking like this smoke layer is pretty prevalent across the northeast of Melbourne and spreading, but this was enough ultimately for me to call off the flight out to Phillip Island and past the CBD. Even though the webcams for the area are looking pretty clear, I've got to trust what's being reported from the official weather sources, and the visibility just doesn't meet the criteria for this flight. It's a bit of a disappointment, but that's okay. After all, I still have a passenger who's keen to go up for a flight, and I don't want to disappoint. So to try to keep to somewhat of a plan, we switched to my alternate flight plan. This time going from Lethbridge down to Torquay instead, and taking a short leg down the Great Ocean Road out to Lorne and back. This is one of my favourite mini taster flights of the area, which should be all clear of the smoke. The whole drive out to the airport, it just felt like the smoke was getting thicker, and the thought is starting to hit me that I don't think I've ever really evaluated what my personal minimum is for visibility specifically. I mean, I know what the legal VFR limit is, but actually flying safely and confidently in those conditions is vastly different to flying with 10, 20, or even 30 kilometers of visibility. So while prepping the plane for the flight, and I've bumped into a few other pilots who had just returned from a flight, spoke about what the visibility was like from the sky, and the general vibe was that visibility towards the north wasn't great, but going down south and getting close to the coastal winds, things should be all clear, so there's no issues in getting out and going and doing some sightseeing. Pushing beyond your comfort level is needed for progress at times, but I like to err on the side of caution, and sometimes I do question whether or not I'm obsessively waiting for the perfect conditions to go flying, but I'm 100% confident that the time that you do want to push the boundaries and to try something new isn't going to be with a passenger in the right seat. So as I'm going through the pre-flight inspection of the plane, take a moment to collect all of the thoughts that have been going through my head and find that I'm wanting to get my aviation and octane fix from not being at the F1 from the previous week. I'm super keen to take my mother-in-law out for her first flight. I'm questioning whether or not I'm being too conservative with my judgment calls based on weather conditions as pilot in command, and I'm feeling a bit of peer pressure now from the feedback and reports of other pilots at the airfield. Ultimately, I've got too many questionable motivators building up in my head, so I've already made the decision. It looks like acceptable VFR conditions on the ground here, and I have full confidence in my abilities to fly the circuit close to the airport, but I'll know if I'm comfortable going any further from the airport from 1,000 feet above ground level. So with full transparency, I run through my thoughts, and and my new latest plan with my mother-in-law, making sure that she's happy and comfortable with the approach as well, and then we strap in and we can finally get moving. As we climbed out to the east, the haze was definitely becoming more noticeable, but it wasn't until we turned back around downwind towards the west that the additional glare from the sun, my comfort levels just weren't right to venture out any further. And ultimately, it's just not going to be as fun and enjoyable from a passenger as well. This was going to be a one-lap, hazy, scenic flight of the circuit, and we can save our money and our gas for another day. This has been a pretty frustrating experience. I mean, this is literally the shortest flight I've managed to date, and there's no doubt we spent more time on the ground taxiing around and warming up the engine, doing our run-up checks than we actually did in the air. And to an extent, I feel like I've wasted my mother-in-law's time a little bit by not scrubbing the flight earlier. I still haven't got my motorsport fix either, but all things considered, I'm still really happy with this flight. Looking back at the whole experience, there's a lot of factors that were stacking up in the background, from weather variables, the changes in flight plans, and feedback from other pilots and peers, the general pressure that I was putting on myself to create and share these moments with family and friends. Ultimately, I want to be the best pilot in command that I can be, and it wasn't until I was back home later that evening and I noticed that there was actually smoke that was starting to spread from the Otway Ranges later in the afternoon coming out over Lethbridge that I'd largely been focusing my attention potentially in the wrong area over the eastern suburbs. So it's a weird feeling to be frustrated that things didn't go to plan, but relatively happy with the choices that I've made in the end. I could have scrubbed the flight in the morning, but if I didn't come out to the airport and see what the local conditions were for myself, I'd probably sink into that mindset of second guessing my judgment. And I know on the ground, we had absolutely more than 5 kilometers of visibility. There's landmarks around the area that are a good reference point to test this. This opened up a gap in my personal minimums, particularly for visibility. How these minimums might change when I'm taking a new passenger out for their first flight. It's the same as crosswind landings, I guess, that the aircraft has a limit and I have my own limits within that too. But would I want to take someone out on their first flight, absolutely pushing those boundaries? Probably not. So as always, I'm keen to hear your thoughts. How do you treat personal minimums, and do they change when you're carrying new passengers? Do you have minimums set for visibility? Let me know in the comments below. I hope to catch you in the next video.